Hello and welcome to True Love, No Shame, a podcast on recovering from Christian purity culture. I'm Danny Fankhauser, author of Shameless, How I Lost My Virginity and Kept My Faith. You can learn more at shamelessthebook.com. I'm here today with Laura, the creator of No Shame Movement, which is, first off, a hashtag, now also a Twitter feed and a website. And Laura, I guess I can ask you what other places are you right now, and how did this movement get started?
Hi. Well, thanks for having me. The most active places right now are Twitter and Tumblr. It's also on Pinterest and Facebook and Instagram. It's a labor of love for me, and I I don't really get paid for any of this, so I'm the person that updates them. But it did start off as a hashtag, basically wanting to talk more about purity culture online and feeling like the conversation that was having was inadequate. What was being had was inadequate, and I talked with two people that I had built a relationship with online about my idea, and we brainstormed and we came up with No Shame Movement, and then we shortened it for Twitter. And then I decided, well, I might as well make a Twitter website, a Twitter site, and it kind of went from there. So yeah, it has basically grown organically. But the first and foremost, the purpose of it is to be a platform. So I don't write a lot of posts for it. I basically elevate a lot of people's stories and I curate information. And when I talk about it being organic, I pay attention to what kinds of conversations people are having and the stories people are sharing. And from when it started, it started out with purity culture, but it's branched out to, I talk about relationships, about particularly abuser dynamics, about gender norms and gender roles. I talk a lot about sexual orientation and gender identity, because a lot of the folks that were following and supporting the site had, sort of different kinds of backgrounds and had different ways that this rhetoric had affected them, because of course it affects people differently. But those were the narratives that came out, just people feeling, well, people, especially people who are LGBT, feeling erased from the whole concept altogether. And then people who felt like they were being stifled or felt that this was a notion that didn't include them. I heard, especially from a lot of women, most of the people I would say that support the site are women or people identify as women. But I heard from a lot of plus size women, particularly, who talked about how one of the probably unintended consequences was for them being by default immodest, or it being a standard that wasn't meant for them. I also am I'm really interested in featuring stories from people who are overlooked. I myself am a Black American cisgender woman, since a cisgender straight woman. One of the motivations for the tag was that there was starting to be a conversation. There was some evangelical bloggers who have been talking about it, and I noticed the conversation mostly centered on white women, and it also seemed to have a caveat. It would say purity culture is bad, but at the end there was still only one choice. You still had to wait, but hey, maybe we should just not shame people, but still wait. And it's like, well, what about the rest of us that don't want to wait, or find ourselves in our 30s like myself and not married yet, or some people who don't want to get married. Or when purity culture, when No Shame Movement started at the time, it was still illegal in most states for some people to get married. So yeah, so for me, it was like I wanted to add my perspective to the conversation, because, like I said, it affects people in different ways. But first and foremost, for me as a Black woman, it's important to understand that that was a standard that was not meant for me to begin with, and yet Black women are expected to uphold that standard. So yeah, those were my main motivations.
Yeah, and I think that's why the name is so perfect, because it does have so many applications to different situations that people have, especially coming from this concept of of purity culture. And I love that you mentioned that people talk about it like there's still only one option, because that's kind of what I see as well, as even with like the very like feminist and progressive bloggers, that they'll be open and affirming of a lot of other things, but on this one topic they still I feel like a lot of them still don't come out and say like, hey, it's okay to have sex before you're married. So let's actually talk
Right.
about your background too. I think you grew up evangelical as well? That's my
Mhm.
background.
Yeah, I grew up, well, I guess it was maybe not a hodgepodge. I grew up around and in evangelical communities. We went to a Mennonite church for part of my childhood, and actually went to a Mennonite college. I went to a Black Pentecostal or Charismatic church for some time as well. But I would say, yeah, as far as community was concerned, or the Christian culture that I know the most about, I would say it's evangelical, and particularly mostly white evangelical communities. I I grew up. I'm giving away my age, but I grew up in the 90s. So in the 80s, there was the moral majority. Evangelicals were all excited because they felt like they had a friend in Ronald Reagan in the White House, and that was kind of the start of the church getting more involved in politics. So when I was a teenager and in college in the 90s, uh, so it was kind of after the moral majority, and it was when there was this kind of frenzy of we need to make Jesus cool for the kids, but we also need to make sure they keep their legs closed. And so, the stereotype of the youth pastor, with who's like 50 and dressed like a 20-year-old and like and uses outdated slang and stuff. I feel like, and I know there might be people who are older than me that can dispute that, but I feel like a lot of that started when I was a teenager or became popular. Conservative Christian music. I'm giving an anthropologist answer, sorry. um, well, like conservative Christian music, like, oh, we're the Christian version of Jay-Z.
Oh yeah, the Christian
Yes.
bookstore with like the grid of music
Yes.
where you could find what you would
Yes.
like.
That became larger and more controversial when I was a teenager. So yeah, so I feel
Mhm.
like it was not just the community, but the time period that I grew up in really shaped a lot of what I understood about Christianity. I actually moved overseas with my parents as a teenager. We went to Ghana and West Africa. They went there to do mission work, and that actually was the start of my own sort of, I guess, unlearning, because I was basically pulled out of my comfort zone and was in a foreign country as a missionary kid and trying to navigate a new culture as a teenager when your own worldviews haven't fully formed yet either. So that also has that heavily influences how I see faith and kind of how I see myself as a Christian. And
Hmm. Totally. Yeah. And I think I grew up in the same time. And I remember, like, I also read Brio magazine, which I think that's part of what you're saying is like
yes,
Christian, like, media just had to have its own version of everything. I remember at one point the Christian bookstore
yes,
sold books of the Bible that were designed as magazines. So you could look like you were reading a magazine, but it was actually just like the Bible.
I remember that. Yeah.
Right?
I Brio is, that Brio started up again.
Oh, did it? No, I didn't know that.
Yes, it did. I actually took one for the team and subscribed
Uh huh.
because they don't have hardly any online presence, which I think is fascinating.
Yeah.
But and it's a different editor
Uh huh.
than before. But yeah, they started up I think in the spring. Um
Mm-hmm.
I I had a project for a while where I was live tweeting some of the articles.
Oh, yeah.
'Cause I Yeah, because I thought I'm really curious. I want to see what they're posting, but I'm gonna have to give them my hard-earned $20 in order to find out. But yeah, it's basically kind of an answer to Teen Vogue.
Oh, okay.
Um, if you've been kind of following, they had been doing a lot more hard-hitting journalism, talking about justice and things like that. And so Focus on the Family was kind of like, oh, okay, we need to offer a Christian alternative. And so they decided to bring Brio back. Now, incidentally, they did not bring back Breakaway,
Interesting.
which was the guy's version.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's interesting too. Um, but yeah, so yeah, that's back. I'm gonna try to do more tweeting of that. Just FYI, I use the hashtag Lola Reads Brio. Um, so and I can send you that hashtag if you like. But yeah, it's really interesting because it's fairly obvious that it's mostly for parents um who are worried about their kids, you know, going to hell in a handbasket.
Mm-hmm.
And not so much. And I mean, it's supposed to be for teens, but I mean, just the nature of the writing and the topics. It's really for parents.
Right.
So yeah, it's kind of interesting. I've been trying to track the online presence. I haven't seen a lot of people talking about it. So yeah, I don't know, it's kind of interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, that's super interesting. And then what about music too? I know I remember this Rebecca St. James song, "Wait for Me," that was like a very clear like purity culture song. Was there
Yeah,
any other music
yeah.
that kind of influenced you back in the day?
DC Talk.
Mm-hmm.
If you remember them. I was a huge fan. Actually, I still listen to them. There's some leftovers from my CCM phase that I still listen to because I actually think they make good. I think they're hilarious that they make good music. But yeah, they were a huge influence. I had a huge crush on Toby Mac.
Uh-huh.
um, yeah, and I remember what and it's funny because I feel like even when I was a teenager, when I knew I was supposed to believe this stuff, I was still skeptical. And I still found a lot of these pro waiting songs corny.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and what was it? Oh, I Don't Want It. That was their most pro abstinent song. I Don't Want Your Sex. That was on the Free at Last album. And I mean, just listening to it, it's like it was, even then, it was my least favorite song because I just thought it was a stupid song. And there was another one called That Kind of Girl, and it's basically 3 minutes of slut shaming.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Yeah.
and talking about the kind of girl he wants and the kind of girl he doesn't want, women who smoke or drink or curse, or other unseemly things. So those are the two that pop into my head immediately. There's also they were part of the Winans
Oh, like BB
family
and CC or
compound.
yeah.
It was Angie and Debbie. Yeah,
Okay.
Angie and Debbie. Actually, they had a ballad that was actually a really good ballad, but it was really problematic lyrics. It was basically about, it felt like love, and it's kind of the trope of, you think you're in love, or you think sex is love, but it's not. It's not real love. Waiting, you need to wait. That's real love.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but yeah, so those are the three that come to mind the most.
Yeah. And then what about your family? Did your parents have like a talk with you about sex, or how did you kind of learn about it from that angle?
Yeah. Well, they had it was interesting. They were good about just sitting me down, telling me the basics. They actually did that when I was 8. And that I'm very grateful for. It was a pretty short conversation. But yeah, they told me the basics. And before I get into how they gave me a lot of terrible advice, I will say this. My mother always called genitalia their actual names. And it never occurred to me until I was an adult, and especially when I was working with kids and being around parents. Like, my mother never had nicknames. They were penis and vagina. And like, there's a lot of other problematic stuff she said, but I do appreciate that because, even now, like, I have a hard time using, like, I'll use them like sort of tongue-in-cheek nicknames, but I can't really fathom calling them anything else, and I can't fathom calling them something else to your child, or believing that it's wrong to say penis and vagina in front of your child.
Right. Well, I've also heard that it helps prevent abuse if kids know the name of that, because then they can speak about if something wrong happens.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it's just,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't understand why you wouldn't want your child to know the name of something that's on their body. Um,
Right.
but yeah, so that's that one thing they did well. But for the most part, uh, the message was mostly from my mom, and it was, God wants you to wait till you're married. But more importantly, sex was something that men and boys want to get from you, and you have to keep them from getting it. That was essentially how it was
Hmm.
framed, which had probably unintentional on her part, but the unintentional consequence of making me think that men were predators, or I kind of internalized that men were predators, and it really affected
Hmm.
my relationships, or attempted relationships when I was older. Um, she would try to have talks with me, and she would always say, you know, you can always ask me questions if you have questions. And I'll say this, and if there's any parents listening to your podcast, and I'm sure there probably are, um, and you're wondering about your kids being honest with you, don't set them up to lie. I think that's one of the biggest things. Don't set your children up to lie. If on one hand you say, which my parents did, oh well, you can always ask questions, but on the other hand, at every chance you get, you paint sex as dirty. When people use sexual terms, you say that's disgusting. When you tell your young daughter that women get yeast infections because they have too much sex, because I
Mm.
remember the yeast infection commercials would come on, and she'd say those women got it from having sex, and then I learned later that you could also get it from wearing tight jeans and all
Yeah.
that. um, because of that, like, my mother said one thing, but I never felt comfortable asking her any detailed questions, because of her approach to it.
Hmm.
Um,
Because
and I think
things
that's
were like
really,
clearly like bad, so it was sort of like,
yes.
yeah.
And so I think that starts with just you, not even when you sit down. Like, sex ed really is your everyday language. It's not just what you and I want to be a parent one day, and hopefully I'll remember this. But it's not just what you sit down and tell them. It's also how you react to things on TV, how you react to things that you see, like, in movies, or basically, yeah, like, it's the way you react to people who have different beliefs, yeah, all of that, like that. Kids pay attention to that, and they internalize the messages you send. If you are watching a movie, and your kid, and you go through scenes where, like, Arnold Schwarzenegger mows down 20 people with a machine gun, but then as soon as a sex scene starts, then you fast forward, that sends a message. That sends a very clear
Mm.
message,
Hmm.
about, like, what you believe is acceptable and what isn't. And not that my parents condoned violence, but it's very telling, and that sticks with people when violence is not as objectionable as a sex scene.
Yeah, I mean, that would make it very hard to ask a simple question about sex if it's like something that's always fast forwarded and like something that you're not supposed to see.
Right. And also, just I never really learned, and that's one of the biggest things about having this community, is finding other like-minded people. I found that it can really leave you emotionally stunted, because I never really learned how to form a relationship. I never learned how, like, what to do if you liked a guy, um, how to approach him, or what, it was always keep them away, keep them away. Um, you don't have time for crushes. Um, keep boys away. And so when you get to be an adult and you're trying to navigate relationships, That was the biggest thing for me. Is I still have a hard time. I still have not been in any long-term relationship. That's one of the main reasons others are I have a hard time staying in one place. But that it has long-term consequences in terms of their ability to form healthy relationships. So yeah, so that's in a nutshell, I think how my parents taught or didn't teach me about sex. I also had no formal sex education. I was pulled out of public school after 5th grade, partly because of that, because they were going to start sex ed. And I was put into Christian schools after that. And of course, it was Keep Your Legs Closed was our sex ed there.
Yeah, I was in public school in California, and they did have like a health class that had a week that was on sex ed, but your parents had to sign a permission slip, and I was the one person in my class that did not take part in that. So I essentially did not have sex ed either. Yeah, I think what you're saying is so interesting because I had such a similar experience where I kind of got to my mid 20s and was like, I'm like, I haven't really dated at all. And that's why I started online dating, because I just didn't know how to approach the situation. I didn't know how to flirt with someone or express interest. And it was kind of like, I'm suddenly going to be, like 55 and still be single and alone if I don't figure this out somehow. But that's why I think it's so interesting how you're kind of talking about the idea that like men are predators and women have to kind of like fight them off, because I think that's also what I internalized.
Right. And like it's unnecessary, like it's a part of sort of the dichotomy of we're so scared of they're so scared of their kids making wrong decisions. And I know my mom and dad had the best of intentions for me. Like I know this wasn't stuff they did out of like malice or anything. But if you're not equipping folks to if you're not equipping folks to approach these things in the right way, and on the other hand, but you're supposed to be married, those things really don't add up.
Yeah.
And I think the biggest thing, again, going back to sort of the dichotomy, is that you don't learn boundaries. That's something I've been thinking about a lot more lately, especially with all the stuff that's been going on with predatorial men being outed everywhere. It's quite glorious. But for me, it's when you don't learn how to set boundaries with a significant other, or even with don't be friends with someone of the opposite sex, which is ridiculous. Because again, it sets people up to only, and particularly for men, to only see women as sex objects. If it's like, well, you can't be friends with a woman, um, and if you and also if you teach kids that like there's a slippery slope and like there's no in between, like you either are chaste or as soon as you start kissing, it's just you're on the freight train to fornicationville and there's no stopping. Again, that's really unhealthy for people because for one thing, like you were talking about earlier, I think it can open folks up to abuse in situations where assault is involved. Because if you don't learn, if you think of yourself as someone who's just this less driven animal who can't stop, how is that a healthy way to see yourself and your sexuality? Um, if you're or just the fact that you can say no. Like I know of quite a few friends growing up who got the same message as me, but never really got the message you can say no. Like if you're in a situation with a significant other, you can just say no. And many, there were consequences from that. And they're sort of dealing with the fallout of I didn't know that I could refuse. So yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, boundaries I think are huge.
Yeah, I think that was also my experience when I started dating non-Christians, was that I just like I didn't know if there was some sort of etiquette, and just because of what I had learned in church, I just thought that like they would want to sleep with me on the first date, and that like that was something I was supposed to do. And so it took a while to realize like actually even non-Christians, like they don't really do that for the most part, and it's always just up to personal preferences, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Right. So it reminded me of something else too. Yeah, like the other dichotomy of non-Christian versus Christian. You also set people up for failure and bad relationships when you paint, like you said, like, well, non-Christian, like for women particularly, for non-Christian men, will just want to take from you and they won't respect you, but Christian men will. And again, just all the host of problems the host of problems that creates, and also partly why we have so many hurt Christian men on social media objecting to the Church Too hashtag, talking about sexual abuse in the church, because it's just, you've been taught, well, Christian equals respect and good, and we treat women well, and that's simply not true. And again, when you paint this sort of false sense of security, if you give people a false sense of security, again, that can lead to all kinds of situations, and it can lead to people being in abusive relationships, and all those other kinds of things.
Yeah, and so just to rewind a little bit, I know you mentioned it, moving to Ghana was kind of a turning point for you. What was kind of like the deconstruction, or what really like changed your mind about the way that you think about faith, especially in terms of intimacy?
Well, I up until then, I was especially the last 4 years, the 4 years before I went to Ghana, I was in a Christian, conservative Christian school, and there was a lot of talk about godly dating, dating God's way, and it was okay, it was allowed, just no funny business. And then I moved across the ocean to Ghana, which is a majority Christian country, and and now this was in the 90s, so I can imagine that, there's probably been a lot of stuff that's evolved since then. But back then, I learned very quickly that dating was not considered a Christian thing to do. And I remember just kind of stopping and thinking, wait, what? Because, when you're a teenager, the adults around you, especially in the Christian communities, they're very black and white, right? They're like, well, we're really clear and we have the answers and we're giving them to you. So the adults in my life in the US were clear that dating was okay as long as X, Y, and Z happened. The adults in Ghana were clear that dating was not okay. And so at some point, I stopped and thought, somebody's lying. And and since then, and that was the start. I didn't know it at the time. I still believed. I had bought the purity culture thing for years, but that really was the start. That was the seed that was planted. Because all of a sudden, it's like, oh, there's other ways to be Christian. And then there's a whole host of other things. I remember the first time I met a pastor who was a woman, was in Ghana. The first time I heard a pastor curse. I laugh about it now, but at the time I thought, wait, she's a pastor, but she's cursing. I don't understand. Just so many different things. And where I realized, wait, there's a different way that people can be. And this is something that a lot of missionary kids in general, and a lot of kids that spend some of their childhood in other countries, they deal with a lot, and then coming back home and reconciling a lot of that. But yeah, that was a huge influence. And I remember the first time I met a Christian who who was sexually active and was not ashamed of it, because that was another thing. And I can say particularly, I know, and I've talked with this with other Black Christian friends in the Black church particularly, because there is a form of purity culture that sometimes takes on different forms, but similar messages in the Black church as well. But there's this notion of, like, there's folks that go to church and they listen to the message, and they go out and they're sexually active, but they kind of live in this gray area where, like, well, we know our pastor says it's wrong and we know it's wrong, but we're going to do it anyway. And I think there's a lot of Christians in general that do that and did that especially. So when I was younger, I mean, I knew of like other teenage friends who had gotten pregnant, or male friends who had gotten their girlfriends pregnant, but it was always a level of shame around it, always.
Mm-hmm.
And in college, I was talking to someone who was talking about her first sexual experience, and she just kept talking, and I just, like, I was waiting for the, and I'm, I feel ashamed, but it never came. Like, she just kept talking about it. And again, it was one of those, again, that was a seed. It was, at the time, I remember thinking she was wrong. I didn't tell her, but I remember thinking she was wrong, but also thinking, wait, what? Um, and it's little things like that. When you talk to folks, or you hear things, similar messages over and over, and after a while, you start to reconcile them with what you were taught, and then you try to do the math, and
Mm-hmm.
the math doesn't add up. So yeah, it was, yeah, definitely little points along the way. But again, but for the most part, it has been mostly Christians, who are the folks who kind of helped me understand. Because I had non-Christian friends who were sexually active, but again, like we had talked about that dichotomy before, it was like, oh, well, they're not Christian, so
Mm-hmm.
that was the explanation. But then when Christian friends would talk about it, that was when I started understanding what all this meant. And that's why, for me, like, when I talk about my faith, like, I try to make it clear on the site that I do identify as Christian, although a lot of the folks that are supporters, I know, have left the church, or many are atheists, or just want nothing to do with religion, which I understand, and I try to elevate all of those voices. But I also think, just knowing my own experience, for someone, I want to stay in the church, and for other people who want to stay in the church, I think it's important for them to hear those voices, um, as well. So
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. It's crazy that even once you've rejected the entire belief system, that some of these feelings and fears can still stick with you.
yeah, and that was the biggest lesson, even before I started the site, that really struck me, because I've always had friends of different beliefs. That was another good thing my parents did. They never really surrounded us with all Christian people. We were never really in a Christian bubble. And so, I had always known people with different beliefs. But it didn't really hit me how much that can be a part of someone's life, even if they've never set foot in another church in their whole lives. And building those relationships online, that was, that's what that really taught me, was, this stuff really does stay with you. And there's a lot of folks that actively write about it who, are no longer religious, and yet they understand, yeah, like, they understand that this stuff has stayed with them. And that was really significant, and it makes sense. But that was a really significant thing to learn.
Yeah, and I know this is something that you've been tracking for a while now. So, who do you think? What are some of the people online who are writing about this that someone should pay attention to if they're dealing with this kind of issue?
Let's see. Actually, I actually have a Twitter list.
Oh, nice.
I call it Purity Culture Warriors.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Nice.
and I probably need to update it. Well, first and foremost, there's Diana Anderson. I think she was one of the people I first started hearing the term purity culture from, and she's the author of Damaged Goods. There is Taupe. I cannot remember how to pronounce her last name, but she is on Twitter as Grace is Human. She also talks. She has written for Rewire in the past about purity culture, and she's actually second generation Nigerian American. Also similar to me, grew up around a lot of white evangelicals, and she's actually written a lot of good things about it. There is Queer Theology, which I cannot recommend enough. That was started by uh, Shay Kearns, who's a transgender ordained minister, and I forgot the name of the person that runs it with him, who's a gay cisgender man. I think his name is Brian. but they run Queer Theology, and they write a lot about being LGBTQ issues from a theological perspective, and it's a whole community. Definitely worth checking out. Let's see. I'll have to make a list because there's people they're running through my mind. I would say Elel Cruz Lopez, also a bisexual organizer, has written a lot. I think he's written for Sojourners about being bisexual. He started Faithfully LGBT. It was a hashtag, and then it's now I think an organization. That's really important. Hannah Pash and Emily Joy, two phenomenal young women who have also talked a lot about purity culture. They actually started something called the Purity Culture Rehab Project. They were the ones who started Church 2. So, there's the Me Too hashtag, and they came out with Church 2, which was a hashtag to talk about sexual harassment, abuse in the church. They're definitely two just really bright women who have done a lot of really good work around this. There's a blog called Tell Me Why the World is Weird, and it's a young woman who writes what I would say is probably the most comprehensive breakdowns of purity culture that I've seen, particularly when it comes to relationships. She's recently married, so she talks a lot about how it plays out in her own marriage. But definitely, I wish I always want to drive traffic to them because I think it's a really good site. I know I'm leaving someone out.
It's like thanking people at the
Yeah.
Oscars. It's like don't
Oh,
want to.
Samantha Field, also
Oh yeah,
blogs about this, and yeah. And as far as, and then there's also just folks on Twitter who talk a lot about this stuff. Some that don't necessarily have their own blog. There's actually, and I have a list of those folks as well. There's Verdell Wright and Jessica Sanders. They have a podcast called Dell and Jess, and they talk about Christianity and theology, and also kind of from an evangelical lens. Linda K. Klein, that's what I was leaving out. She actually wrote a book that I am actually quoted in, that she interviewed me for, about purity culture. Also someone around my age who grew up sort of in that community and came to sort of leave it behind and leave the teachings behind. And her book is coming out sometime next year. And she's also I'm really excited about it, just about some of the stuff she's going to be doing. But I have a link to, like I said, people that either blog about it or talk about it a lot online. I have a link to that list on the No Shame Movement Twitter page, and that's also a good reminder for me to check to update that. But yeah, there's a lot of good people. My hope is that continues to become more diverse. I think I think a lot of the folks, it's overwhelmingly white and it's overwhelmingly straight and cisgender. And of course, I include myself in the last two. And one of the things that I really hope to happen from my site is that it inspires other people to start. I'm a big believer in staying in my lane. And when I talk about sexuality, I talk about it from my lens. Um, I don't, for example, I don't have a disability, or I don't have a visible disability actually. And so there are people who talk about sexuality and disability who are people who are disabled. And so I like elevating them because they are more qualified to talk about that. Women who are plus sized or people who are non-binary. I try again, I elevate those, but the person who can talk the most nuance about those subjects are the people who are in those categories. And so that's one big thing is I hope to see more diversity. I think there's a lot of great voices that are talking now. But there's always something new to learn. I mean, I'm always learning something new from the people that write into the site or the people I talk with online about period culture from a different perspective. So, yeah.
Yeah, and so if someone listening feels like their voice isn't being heard, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you or to share their story through your site?
Email would be the best. I mean, if they want to talk to me, they can email me, and it's always I'm always glad. I don't get a whole lot of emails, but I either get people who like what I'm saying, or people that take the time to admonish me for promoting what is it? Promiscuity, accused of promoting Satan. That was a favorite. Someone told me I was promoting Satan. That was actually on a blog I wrote, a blog post I wrote. Or shaming virginity. That was my favorite. That's also my favorite. You're shaming virgins. You're shaming abstinence. And that's and that's when I tell them I'm actually currently abstinent, but sure, I'm shaming it. I'm doing it by choice, but yeah. So if they want to talk to me, they can email me noshamemove@gmail.com. It's NOSHAMEMOV @gmail.com. If they want to share a story, they can go to noshamemovement.com. Right now it's hosted through Tumblr. So if you have a Tumblr account, you can share like a story, sort of a thought, or anything like that. You can share that on the website. Many people ask questions, and again, someone who stays in my lane. Many people ask relationship questions, which I am absolutely not qualified to answer, because my longest one has lasted like, I don't know, a few weeks, 2 months. So um, I tell them,
Yeah.
here's what I think, but I cannot give you advice on that. So people can ask questions, but often, most of the time, if I don't know the answer, or if I don't really feel like it's in my wheelhouse, I'll pose it to the rest of the readers. But yeah, and I'm also fairly soon going to start doing a little bit more promotion of getting people to share their stories. Because again, kind of going back to, I've been doing just a lot of curating right now, and just putting purity culture related news on the site, but I want to go back to stories. And one of the biggest, I think there's like a lot of great bloggers. The biggest thing is when there's someone, digging their heels in and saying, as there are quite a few, won't name names, um, but it's a coalition of gospel people. Um, but when folks are digging their heels in and they say, well, this stuff isn't harmful, and I can write a post, or I can post 10 stories that are similar to each other,
Right.
proving them wrong. And so for me, the site, like, that's really what I wanted to do is like, here are some receipts for maybe purity culture didn't harm you, but it harmed a lot of other people. And here are their stories. And it's harder, well, and they'll still argue with them, but it's harder to argue with 10 people or 100 people who are all telling you the same thing. Bless their hearts, they will still try. But so yeah, that's the biggest thing. You can also tweet the site, or you can tweet me as well, especially if you have links. People send links sometimes to things that are of interest, or like their own stories. People that share stories on the purity culture hashtag, I try to look for those as well. So yeah, those are the three main ways.
Awesome. Cool. Well, loved talking to you about this, Laura. Thank you so much for taking
Of
the time to be
course.
on the podcast. And thank you, everyone listening. Definitely check out No Shame Movement. And we will be back soon with more.